All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so excited to be here tonight to celebrate queer horror across time. Gwendolyn Kiste in conversation with Lee Mandelo. And this is in celebration of two books, The Woods All Black, which just came out yesterday, and The Haunting of Velkwood, which came out about 2 weeks ago. And I am a big horror nerd, and y'all are two of my absolute favorites. So this is my fanboy ideal. So my favorite part of having this job is that I get to play matchmaker for authors I love. And so I get to set up conversations I want to hear and, hope that other people want to hear them too. I'm glad, judging by our audience, that it seems like I'm correct and that lots of people want to hear y'all talk. I think, thinking of this as queer horror across time, I was joking with Gwendolyn that it feels weird to me as a person in my 40s that your book is historical, even though it's just set in the 90s. And Lee's book is truly historical, set in the 20s, 1920s. But they are both historical. And so I think we're going to talk some about that, talk about different kinds of horror, occult, what makes a book horror, what makes a book just spooky and fun. If you're new to these authors, they both have amazing back catalogs of books. They're both in anthologies and other things too. So first I'm going to introduce Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn is the Bram Stoker Award-winning author of The Rust Maidens. She's also the author of And Her Smile Will Untether the Universe, Pretty Marys All in a Row, The Invention of Ghosts, Bone Set and Feathers, and Reluctant Immortals. You can go see the online event for Reluctant Immortals on Charis's YouTube channel. Her short fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Nightmare Magazine, Tor's Nightfire, Vestarian, Black Static, Daily Science Fiction, Unnerving Inner Zone, and Lamplight, as well as Flame Tree Publishing's Gothic fantasy series, among others. Originally from Ohio, she now resides on an abandoned horse farm outside of Pittsburgh with her husband, 2 cats, and not nearly enough ghosts. She is joined by Lee Mandelo, who is a critic, writer, and occasional editor whose fields of interest include speculative and queer fiction, especially when the two coincide. His debut novel, Summer Suns, which has been featured in NPR and the Chicago Review of Books, is a contemporary Southern Gothic dealing with queer masculinity, fast cars, and ugly inheritances. Other work can be found in magazines such as Tor.com, Uncanny, and Nightmare. He has also been a past nominee for awards including the Nebula, Lambda, and Hugo. Aside from a stint overseas learning to speak Scouse, thank you. Man, that's a thing I need to learn about because I don't even know how to pronounce it. Mandela has spent his life ranging across Kentucky, currently living in Louisville, and pursuing a PhD at the University of Kentucky. So we are really glad to have both of you here and glad to have everybody watching both virtually and in person. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So if you're here with us physically in the room, we'll bring you the microphone because we want to be able to hear everyone. So both for accessibility reasons and for virtual audience reasons, just please wait till I bring the microphone to you. And for our virtual friends, please put your questions in the chat at any time and we will work them in. But without further ado, please put your hands together. Gwendolyn Kiste and Lee Mandelo.
Ooh. Wow, that was intense.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Yay. All right. Cool. All right. Yeah. Well, congratulations on your book release yesterday.
And yours 2 weeks ago.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So hauntings. Huh?
Yeah, hauntings.
Should we start there?
We can start there. That's
right.
always a good place to start.
Yes.
We all have ghosts, right?
Yes. And I feel like, particularly with yours, it's an interesting kind of haunting and ghosts.
Yeah, I like to think so. Thank
Yeah.
you for saying so.
Haunted neighborhood? How would you describe it?
Yes.
To the people.
Yes. So the Haunting of Velkwood is about a haunted neighborhood and the 3 girls who escaped the night before the whole neighborhood and everyone in it became ghosts. And now it's it's 20 years later, and one of them is finally going to go back and try to see if she can find her sister who's still trapped inside and kind of settle the score with the ghosts in the past. So yeah.
Yes, it's very neat. Yeah.
Yeah. So how about yours? Tell us about yours.
Yeah. So I would say the haunting in this book particularly is a little bit more of a creature than a ghost specifically. Our protagonist is a member of the Frontier Nursing Service. So going out into the eastern Kentucky counties, providing reproductive health care. This was a real thing that existed historically for people who could not access any kind of hospitals or health care at all. You're in the middle of nowhere in the hollers. And
Hollers,
when
I love it.
he gets there, he realizes it's a deeply religious town, and there's more going on than he knew when he showed up, such as another young person who goes by he, him, we'll say, and uses the name Stevie, but the townsfolk have some disagreement about whether he is a boy or not. He's pretty sure, and they're not. And so there is a lot of conflict that our protagonist Leslie falls face first into in the town around gender and performance and how you get to be. And then, there's a little bit of revenge with a creature behind it, I would say. But how do we get there? That's the fun part.
And yours takes place in like 1926 Kentucky.
29.
29.
Yeah.
Okay.
So right on the cusp.
Yeah. Okay. Why did you choose that time?
Yeah, so 1929, I feel like in the interwar period, you're in that awkward trough where everything is starting to go really wrong, broadly speaking, in mostly Western Europe and the US. We had a nice moment in the 20s, the pansy craze in the US, Weimar Berlin, all of these things happening. Queer people, trans people are living public lives and making art and making community. And then fascism happens. And 29 is sort of a pivot point culturally where you start to see these things happen. And we are contemporarily back in the 20s with the rise of fascism again.
Yes.
So I'm sort of feeling a way in the text that it might be historical, but it's also very much about the now.
Yeah, I think that that's such an interesting thing. I've written my book, like, it's 20 years before, and we deal with some things that happened in the 90s and everything. And it's like, it's always interesting when you're researching things, or if you've lived through them, kind of going back and being like, what's changed and how much has stayed the same and how much have we fallen back? And it's like, one of the things that scares me the most is how everything feels like it's a cycle. And it's like, on the one hand, I try to tell myself, well, things will eventually get better again. But it's also the idea that it feels like we can't ever solve our problems. Yeah. And that's something, how were you thinking about that when you were writing yours?
So I proposed this in 2020, and you'll notice it's now 2024. The book is coming out.
Yeah.
And part of it was starting to work on the project that I thought I wanted it to be in the political moment that I had started researching and writing was honestly too difficult, like emotionally. It took a very long time to dig into some of those things as toothily as I wanted to not sort of flinch almost from having to dig really into the violence in a very particular way, both personally and politically in the text. So we got there. But I also think dealing with the 90s is a really closer inflection point that is in your memory. Like I was a child, but I remember it.
Yeah, I was a child too, but I remember it as well. And some people have, and I have some nostalgia for the 90s. I don't want to say that I hate everything about the 90s. Like sometimes I can be like really like, ugh. But I do think it's interesting when you sometimes talk to people that like straight people in particular have a lot happier memories of the 90s than queer people do. I feel like if you grew up in the 90s as a queer person, it's a lot scarier. You have a lot scarier memories because it was like the religious right was really rising at that point. And there was so much homophobia and it was so frightening, the things that just people casually would say. Not that they don't say those things now, but I feel like there's more allyship now than there was then. And so that was something that going back to was very frightening and kind of sifting through those memories. But then even so, then there's like a point in the book where one of the characters says to the other one, like, girls couldn't get married to girls. Like it's a little girls, like, girls couldn't do that. And, and the character's like, there's such a difference between now and then. But then like, as I'm writing it now, it's like, now we're back and it feels like we're in this cycle again, that it's like, are we going to lose these rights, the way we've lost other rights? So it's odd again about that and terrifying about that cycle of like, you think, okay, we've gotten to this point. maybe we'll stay here for a while, but it feels like everything is always changing, and it's like you can never get the ground like kind of stay solid under your feet, and that's really frightening.
Yeah, periods of backlash I think can be very, very, very alarming, and I'm thinking about kids especially, like as a reference point, I think in both of our texts in different ways, or teens getting out of their childhood, is that for a minute, I don't know, I kind of felt like, oh, they won't have to do it how we did at that point. And now seeing it come back to that. Yeah, and it's like really difficult. Oof.
It is. And it's very sad because it's like, and I still say, listen, I still think things are better now than they were 25 years ago, you know, and I don't want to kind of get lost in kind of the negativity of it's worse. And it's like, you know, I'm like, no, I don't think it's worse in every way, but it might be worse in some ways, and it could continue to get worse. And it's like that backslide, like you said, and that backlash. And it's like, you know, dealing with that, especially when you're writing historical work, is very interesting of like, okay, this is in the past, but could this also be our future? And that's very, very scary.
Yeah. And I think part of what I ended up getting into with that that I'll be interested to hear you talk about too, is the idea of maybe I'd say vengeance in mind, because it is in a tradition of the bash backstory or rape revenge, like fiction. Got a feel good element, we'll say, the revenge part, a very unique kind of feel good. But it's dealing with what we can do as resistance, and that sometimes violence is an answer to those things, etc.
Yeah, and I think especially with horror, like even if it's something that maybe we as the author are like, I might not go out and do this because maybe I don't want to spend the rest of my life in prison, but my characters can do it, especially like with supernatural means and things like that. I think that that's very potent as a way of dealing with these issues, because I agree with you. Sometimes it's like, you know, there's a lot of possibilities, but sometimes violence, and especially fictional violence, is very cathartic. It's a very cathartic moment for queer people to be able to say, hey, you know, I'm going to fight back now. Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely something in my book, Haunting of Velkwood, as well, of like, okay, how are they resisting this? How are they going against how they're being raised? And these, you know, how narrow their existences are. Like, you aren't allowed to do this, you aren't allowed to do that. We're going to keep controlling you in every way that we can. And how do you fight back? Yeah.
That can be really powerful in horror, I think, especially in a way, I think, like playing with the genre space and what you get to do in a Gothic or in a horror novel. I feel like I tend to be on the cusp a little bit. Like, I'm writing Gothics, but they're also horror. I love horror. Yeah. Everyone can tell there's some DNA in there and they're related. And I think this one really is the most, maybe, of all my books, because it is so much about the horror of dealing with like the Pentecostal church in a southern small town, the horror of religious violence and lack of autonomy in the face of that, and what you all maybe kind of wanted to do in the face of that experience as a teenager or a young adult and couldn't, because most of us don't get that kind of revenge. You just escape, hopefully, and deal with it.
Yeah.
And I think some of the, like, what do you do after you get out is also a lot of what's going on here that I'd love to hear more about.
Yes. A lot of my work in general is after an event, after something horrible has happened. And it's a lot about dealing with that aftermath, because I think so much of trauma and grief are about dealing with aftermath. And a lot of times horror, not a lot of times, but, you know, I think, you know, much of the horror I was exposed to growing up is, here's a traumatic event, like the slasher killer is coming after you. And, you know, whether you survive or you don't survive, and then it ends. And I always have thought, like, okay, but how do you live with it? Like, how do you move forward from that moment on? Because I feel like there's such a story there. So a lot of my work deals with that. And the Haunting of Velkwood really deals with the idea of like, okay, I've lived with this grief. There's this haunted neighborhood. Like, I've lost my entire family, but there are reasons for that. And maybe that family wasn't even the best. And how do I kind of reckon with that? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Just such a good way of dealing with those deep affect, like, emotions we have around trauma and grief, I think.
Yes.
You can do it differently in every genre, right? But I think there's something unique about the very feeling genres like horror, where you're supposed to get really into the meat of the emotion in a way that you're kind of not allowed to in a lot of other spaces in the same intensity, maybe.
Yes, I think horror, like, when I look at like old movies, I always love high melodrama in movies. I just love it. I adore it. And I feel like horror is such high melodrama, and you're allowed to. It's kind of accepted that it's a melodramatic genre. Like, it's all about these intense emotions. And so I feel like when you're dealing with things like grief and trauma, horror is such a great way to explore it because it's already like, you know, you can scream as loud as you want in horror. It's actually expected. And so I feel like that's a place where you can kind of look at these things and like really unpack them.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
What else?
I know. What else? Tell me more about the setting for yours, because like I'm not familiar with 1920s Kentucky. I know some 1920s history. I don't know much about Kentucky at all, even though I grew up in Ohio. So they're kind of similar. There's some similarities there. So
yeah, they share some space.
They do.
Say.
Yeah.
I think what was really interesting for me about Kentucky in that like late 20s period is that you have a city like Louisville that was some of the most fun research, by the way, was the like primary document pictures of like the city that I largely grew up in 100 years ago. Like, oh, they actually built that bridge that I think of as a pretty modern technological innovation. It's the big bridge over to Indiana. No, they were building that in 29. So it's just a thing that we had even then. It was under construction. Like the famous Brown Hotel was already there. There's a bookshop at the bottom that is not there obviously anymore. So it was all these little details. Yeah. So a very urban city. You could get to Chicago by train. Can't do that anymore. So, you know, like all of those things. But then you know, take a truck, however far you can get it, which is not very far. And then from there, you get on horseback and you keep going. And eventually you'll be out in the mining country in Eastern Kentucky. And even in the 20s, that was a little bit like going back another 50 or 60 years. You're completely cut off. A lot of the like holler towns didn't even have electricity. Like you would have a local, maybe couple of generators. And that was it. So you're living a completely different life out in a rural area, which I think is still emotionally true, especially as a queer person, if you have to grow up in a very isolated rural area. So I think there was some of that I wanted to dig into, but also a very cool historical document. There is a reading list at the end of mine because you do all the research, you're going to share it. One of the first documentary films ever recorded on silent film was about the Frontier Nursing Service in 1931, and the NIH has put it up on YouTube. So you can actually see what the towns looked like, what the people dressed like, how they talked. And I thought that was the neatest shit to get to put into a text because it felt very immediate. Yeah. Like they don't look that different if you go out into Eastern Kentucky and go to a small mining town. Some of those buildings might still be the same. And that's really eerie, I think. Yeah. That's part of the Gothic, I think, in that text is the past always kind of comes back. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I love that. The Gothic. I consider Gothic horror. Like I consider it pretty much all, even though, you know, some people be like, no, the Brontes aren't horror. I'm like, the Brontes are horror. They are. Totally horror. And they were like great, like original goth girls anyways. So like totally horror. But yes, I do. I love that. I love the idea of Kentucky Gothic. I think that's wonderful. And I love the video. I think it's so interesting. You don't think of those things as being recorded from that era. And it's so exciting to find those primary documents and be able to kind of go back to that. To think they were lugging a camera that like weighed as much as a person. Yeah. Through rivers on horseback. It's like a miracle the footage made it out, frankly. Good job. Yeah. I feel like to location, there's something about suburbs too, which I think you're getting into. Yes. It's very like, oh yes, there's horror of the suburbs as well. Yes, the suburban Gothic. Like I even wrote an essay about it for Crime Reads recently because like mine is very much a suburban Gothic, like kind of going back to, I love David Lynch. So like Blue Velvet, Twin Peaks. I was thinking a lot of Sofia Coppola's take on the virgin suicides. There's just this very creepy feel to the suburbs. And like somebody asked me recently, like, you know, what's so creepy about the suburbs? And I'm like, there's a lot, but one of the things is that they're planned communities. So it's not a place where it's like, oh, a bunch of people just kind of naturally moved in here. It's like, no, we decided we're going to build this place and it's going to probably be kind of expensive housing, at least to a certain extent. And we kind of keep people out, which also means the secrets stay in. And so like, you know, if you're there and, you know, you're queer or you're different in any way, you know, I mean, that's a real relative term for a lot of people. And it's like those suburbs can be their own kind of prison growing up. And so, yeah, like that was something that I thought a lot about as I was writing Velkwood, because it was like, they are creepy and they're a very odd place to be. I never grew up in the suburbs, but I had family that lived in kind of suburban allotments, and it was like, it was neat,
but it was also like all the houses tend to be the same. Like theirs were all split levels, which I love split levels because now I think they're kind of kitsch.
Yeah.
But like, you know, all of the houses are always the same. So there's this kind of feeling like the Stepford Wives, and it's like it's so homogenized and it's very unnerving because when you have a town that naturally kind of is built, houses are built at different times, you know, it's built around a certain industry, or there's some kind of reason why people are there, as opposed to we are going to live here and, you know, we're going to form this kind of little community to keep people out. Yeah.
The HOAs.
Oh, I didn't even get into that with my HOAs are so scary.
Just
like, have you ever seen the X-Files episode about the HOAs?
I was thinking
because
that
is like one of my favorites, because I'm like, this is for real. This is just documentary. This is
happen.
not a supernatural. I don't even understand why if anyone is in an HOA, I'm not trying to be offensive, but like, I just think they're so weird. Like, I can't imagine having that, like choosing to have that many rules. There's too many rules in life. Why would you be like, I want rules for my house too? Yeah. Like, I can't be trusted to put my mailbox up. I need somebody to tell me how to do it.
The most free time neighbors also to decide how your mailbox should look.
Yeah, it's intense. That's an intense thing. I didn't get into the HOAs in mine. I would need another book.
Yes.
That needs another book if I'm gonna do.
I definitely think there's something about the suburban too, in that way that you experience going back to it. Yes. And I think that's early on in the text kind of a tension. Yeah. Is that if you've gotten out of the suburb, there's still always going to be something there. And I feel like the family goes through a very literal version of that experience if you escaped and had to come back, even if it's outside of a Gothic text. Like for Family Christmas, it's a weird vibe. And I felt like you're really pulling on that, like, what trauma with your family do you not talk about if you go back? Like, what secrets do you all know that no one can say? Yes.
And that was something that I was thinking about as I was writing it, of like how many secrets families keep, and they just keep them, and it's just a thing, and you're just not supposed to talk about it, and you come back and it's like, hey, we're going to pretend like everything's okay, but everything's not okay. It's never been okay, and we don't ever deal with it, and it's just, again, like a cycle. It's just the same thing over and over again. And so that, you know, in the haunted neighborhood, they do eventually, you know, the main character goes back into the haunted neighborhood, and they're stuck in a cycle, a literal cycle that things just keep repeating. And she's, you know, because it is this idea of like, we keep repeating our trauma, and we keep, you know, like you said, when you do go back in and you visit your home, especially if you've gotten out and you build a life that's much closer, hopefully, to what you want. Yeah. And then you go back and it's these reminders of like, hey, this is the person they still see you as. Yeah. And that becomes a really weird, you know, thing messing with your head of like, it's like, oh, no, you're still the person we thought you were when you were 12. And it's like, well, I was never that person even when I was 12, but I'm really not that person now. And like kind of reckoning with that. Yeah.
Do you think the Gothic and Ghosts are a really good way of literalizing a lot of those emotions? Less this book, more Summer Sons, which is for me very much a campus fiction that's also a Gothic about like, hey, what if your best friend who you were maybe in love with died and now his ghost is haunting you and you didn't know you were gay, but it turns out you have some stuff to figure out. And I think so much when I was starting to read Haunting of Velkwood about the way that loss and trauma can be literalized in a really interesting way in Gothics, because not only is it returning in your psyche, it's very much physically there. And, you know, she's not the only person who knows about the haunted neighborhood. It's a phenomenon, which I thought was, you brought up the X-Files, like a very recalled to me in a very positive way experiences of the X-Files. And it's in the 90s. So I feel like that's an echo as well.
That's true.
The Twin Peaks.
I don't know that I was specifically thinking about the X-Files, but people brought it up and it was like, I mean, I remember being a little kid and it was like, I was totally into that show. So it's like, it's there. It's in my head forever. It's in my DNA at this point. So yeah, absolutely.
Because there's some very cool intertextual stuff in yours about like people trying to do research on it. Like podcasts and reporters, and it's this phenomena that exists in the world. And I think we don't always get that in like a ghost story or a Gothic, where sometimes it's only the one person experiencing this very private experience. But this is like really painfully, awkwardly public.
Especially like at the beginning of the book, she talks about how like reporters will still periodically show up trying to get an interview with her, trying to understand it, but because nobody but the three girls who escaped can get back into into the neighborhood, that makes it so like people can't get in there. They just are aware that this neighborhood exists, and people try to research it, but they're not really very good at it. And so it's like, but it's also been 20 years and people have kind of mostly forgotten it. And part of me says no one would forget a haunted neighborhood, but watching how quickly we move on from absolutely everything in culture in our lives, like so many people have forgotten COVID even exists at this point. And I'm like, if we could forget the pandemic in a matter of this, some people could forget the pandemic in a matter of years. We could forget a haunted neighborhood that's minding its own business over there, more or less. So, but that was weird too, because I remember when I started, I'm like, nobody would forget a haunted neighborhood. Like, people would forget after a matter of time. If it's not causing problems, people would forget. And that also weirds me out of like how much, again, we just are like, okay, if it's not right in front of us, this bright new shiny object, like it's like, okay, we just push it aside. So it just
becomes sort of a local thing.
Like that
the
weird
local
town
thing,
that weird thing.
You're like, okay.
So trying to like monsters. Like, how much do you want to talk about it? Because I don't want to give too much away, but like, why monsters? What draws you to monsters? Let me ask you that. That's good.
Someone pointed out at the event last night, which I didn't even realize about my own work, is that I think I'm working through the canon of things, because I had a spooky ghost, and then we had some sort of sci-fi like mind meld kind of horror a little bit, and now we've got a shape-shifting creature. So I feel like the suggestion was next we should do like a Frankenstein monster kind of thing. We'll see. I could see it. I didn't know I was doing that. But I think with this one specifically, the tagline my editor Carl came up with, it's on the front, is that if they call you a monster, show your teeth.
I love that.
Brilliant. Love him. Does a great job. That it's very much about embodying, if you are a queer person, a trans person, both, particularly if you are gendered or your sexual behavior is something that's not really fitting the respectability politics of it all. And now people do consider you in some ways very monstrous. Like still. So what does it mean that instead of like recoiling from that and trying to stuff it down and to fit in, you say, no, fuck you, actually. Basically. Like, this is correct. Maybe I'm right, and we should be living like this. And there is a pleasure in really literalizing that, I think. And some of it is also the Appalachian Gothic of it all, is that those mountains are older than the existence of bones in anything. Like, they're older than vertebrates. And you can really feel that, I think, when you're in the Appalachian Mountains. And I always like to think about how the natural world and maybe what we consider the supernatural world feel very real out there. I don't think of myself as too like superstitious, and then you actually talk about it and you're like, no, I might be very superstitious. Actually, it feels normal, but maybe. And I wanted to really pull all those things together in this one to get, what does it mean to be able to shapeshift into the monster that people claim that you are, but also to get your revenge, and also because it's sexy. I think that everyone who's read any of the tweets from beloved Sophia Adram, if you know their work, they edited Bury Your Gaze that just came out. Monster fucking is a part of the text. That like embracing your monstrousness as like a physical way of being, as an erotic way of being, as a way of defending yourself. Just embracing all of those things.
I think a lot of people who aren't into horror, like are outside of horror, always see monstrousness as a negative. But like, I feel like especially with queer people, horror fans in general, but queer horror fans in particular, really embrace it. Because I've always embraced monstrousness. I've always, I even as a little kid, it's like you feel bad for Frankenstein's monster. It's sort of like maybe one of the first monsters you might see. And like, I think that that's such an interesting thing. And I love how you play with that and deal with that in this book, because I think that it is so powerful. It's a powerful metaphor, and it's a powerful, again, making it literal and what you can do with it. It's not this negative thing, because again, as a queer person, you're often made to feel monstrous, but like, okay, well, if I'm a monster, maybe like you said, maybe being a monster is good. Maybe it's powerful. Maybe there are so many good things about this. So I really love that. I love that so much.
I feel like I'm borrowing a little bit from oh my God, what was it called? It's the queer horror documentary series that Shudder did.
Okay, yeah.
Brian Fuller directed it. Forgot the name. It's great. Part of the first part, it's a 4-parter, is talking about how often the monster is also the other, the outsider, in particularly classic horror fiction, that it makes sense if you are also the outsider or the other,
Mm-hmm.
not even just in terms of sexuality, but there's the horror noir docuseries also about Black horror
Yes.
and other ways of
Yes.
being othered in fiction that you
Yes.
then come to embrace those things. Like,
Yes.
well, actually, hear me out. What if the monster in this normative perspective is right? And it's
Yeah.
the people enforcing the norm who are the real monsters, etc.
Yeah. I just rewatched Carrie because I love it. I mean, I've read it, of course,
Yeah.
too. But like, I feel like as a queer person, I'm always rooting for Carrie. And like, it feels like a queer movie, even though it's not overtly queer. When I was rewatching, like, this is such a queer movie. And like, you know, Chris, the Nancy Allen's character, like I feel like she's like obsessed with Carrie. Like, I never caught that, but I'm like, I feel like there's queer text,
There's an
subtext there.
energy.
Yeah, I'm like, why are you so obsessed with Carrie? I think there's something going on there. Like, and I'm like rewriting it in my head of like, okay, this is a different way of seeing Carrie. But yeah, like, you know, really embracing that in so many ways. I also want to jump to what you said about Appalachia and superstition, because like I'm from Ohio and it's Appalachian Mountains go right through there. So it's like, I love that. Like it feels so ingrained in the culture. Like it's not really separated very much. There's so much kind of just natural belief and superstition that it's like just part of, you know, everyday life. How were you exposed to that growing up? Like what kind of things were part of your sort of day-to-day life? Or
it was stuff I didn't realize was notable, right? Until you travel or meet other people. And you're like, oh yeah, huh, okay. Like, I think I played a little bit more with some of that with the older woman character in the novella, who is kind of like the witchy single older woman who lives on the edge of town and knows when to get out because the going's not good anymore. But who, like, the blue glass bottles is like a thing. You catch spirits. You don't want the bad ones in your house. You put them in a tree, like outside. Is what it is. Horseshoes above the door.
Yes.
You never go out a different door than you went in a house. Like, you don't go in the front and out the back. That's bad luck. Don't sweep across your feet. Like, there's a million of them that I didn't think about.
Yeah.
And a lot of stuff about ghosts and like legacy and respect for the dead that feels very particular. Not even just, I'd say, at the Appalachian region, but like the poor South. Like, think very specifically, which crosses a lot of racial lines too, in ways that people lived together in this way that was not connected to the production of capital and had a lot more connection to community because you needed each other to survive.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, I didn't come up with that. That's academics out there doing the good work. But that there is really something to think about with who came before you, what they did wrong a lot of the time. And that's also the Southern Gothic. I think that's why that's the part of America that has the Gothic so much, is because it is a space of horror for the vast majority of the American South's history, for everyone, but a few select few who are causing the horror for everyone else.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's a failure when particularly white writers are writing the Gothic and don't talk about it. You have to talk about it.
Yeah. That's a very good point. That's a very good point.
Comes up in the novella. Because, hey, you're looking at the reproductive justice movement in the 1920s, and it very much was a eugenic movement. Like, no matter what you do, no matter what you do, like, did it have good outcomes for people? Yes, we don't want to get rid of it. But I feel like one has to acknowledge, as a historical fiction, it was icky.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that when you go back and you get into anything. Like you'll go into it and be like, oh, this seems like it's going to be really good, and then you start unpacking. You're like, oh, there are so many bad roots here. There's so much like rotten in all of this. Yeah, and like you said, it may have led ultimately to good places, but where it came from is not great. No. Not good at all. Not good at all. Yeah, something else. Then I was like, oh yeah, like the reproductive history. Ooh, really lost my train of thought. Now we need to go in another direction.
I did sort of obliquely have a question written down about the ways that gender and sexuality are appearing between the three characters so far, because we have Brett also. Who wanted to just open the door, talk about what's going on with those three there a little bit.
Yes, so the three girls who escaped, our main character is Talitha, then her best friend, kind of estranged now best friend, Brett, and then their third friend, Grace. And so what is your question? I'm curious what your thought is. Like,
it's very clear that I think there's some like gendered sexual trauma going on in the text, very specifically, and that is being worked through differently by the people who experience it versus the friend who sees it versus how they do or don't talk about it in the space.
Yes.
Like, and that experience of your gender in that way.
Yes. Yeah. So Talitha and Brett are both queer characters. They're both bisexual characters. They're not necessarily out at the point where the book starts. And that's, in particular, Talitha, who is struggling a lot with her bisexual, and not at all autobiographical, by the way. That never happened to me. I would never make my main character at least a little bit of a stand-in for my own trauma. But Brett is a lot, kind of at least a little bit more confident in her sexuality than Talitha is. And then we have the third friend, Grace, who, like you said, is much more the spectator, and it is sort of she's the very heteronormative of the three characters. She is mourning because her fiance is trapped in the neighborhood. He was still there. He was like literally the boy next door, and they, fell in love when they were young, and like he's trapped there. So it's like her life completely derailed. So I was very much playing with this idea. I don't know that I've gotten a question like this yet. So thank you for this. I thought that's where you were going, but I wanted to make sure before I answered. I'm like, maybe I'm hearing the question I want to answer. But okay. So
to avoid spoilers.
I know,
carefully.
But yeah, so the idea of how do queer characters navigate this trauma versus someone who isn't queer, but it has her own trauma and is also legitimate trauma. I mean, and so, really trying to explore that and how it is very different for each one of them and how they kind of have this interplay of how they relate to each other because of those differences. So yeah.
I think that kind of looking sometimes at the ways that people see their identity and then see it together can be a really interesting way to unpick some of those, not just struggles, but also the joys and also the ways we don't see other people if we're seeing ourselves too closely.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's some of the fun that I was having with the historical genders that are in The Woods All Black that are still pretty recognizable to a contemporary like queer and trans audience. And they're very different ways of being any of these things that are very geographically, culturally dependent, your age, even what language did you have?
Yeah.
So we have Leslie, who is in the, his parlance, an invert. Like we have sexology happening. He knows what this is. He thinks of himself as like a male spirit, woman body, cool. So like womanhood is not entirely outside of his conception of himself because that is how he's perceiving his sexuality, very tied to his gender, usually dates femmes, like very butch presenting when possible. Like he knows all the words. He's read the books. He's carrying around Virginia Woolf's Orlando. Like he knows what's up, right?
I love that.
And then he meets Stevie, who is very much, does not have any language for this, doesn't have the books, and is like, no, I'm a boy and I like men, but men want to like me like a girl and we're not having that. And then they are really kind of interested in each other from the start, which is distressing for Leslie, who has only ever dated femme women before in any way. It's like, that's a boy, but kind of like me, but not. And Stevie being like, well, do you also just see me in the way that like straight men see me? Because I'm not into that. And how they kind of clash and work through these seemingly on the surface similar identities that are pretty different in their lived reality, but the townsfolk see them all the same. So that's kind of an overarching.
Yeah. I really love that about the book because it too often, I think sometimes queer identity can be treated as a monolith because sometimes it almost feels like we spend so much time trying to explain our sexuality or our gender to people who aren't like the straight community. And so sometimes it feels like we simplify it even for ourselves. Yeah. Because it's easier, and also because so often I think we're told however we feel, it's not legitimate, it's not real. So it's like when you can break it down to this is who I am, I can sum it up in a sentence. Yeah. That's easier. You can explain it to people. You can explain it at Christmas if you have to, even though you probably don't want to. But you can really get through those things a lot easier. But that's not really the lived experience. Lived experience is messy. It's a lot messier. and I love that you really reckon with that and you deal with that with these characters of being like, where are these lines? And maybe they're not clear lines and maybe they're not even supposed to. Why would they have to be? Life is not like a clear line, right? Yeah. So yeah, and I love that. That's such a powerful part of the book. Were there any points where you were worried about how you would depict it or how you would talk about it? You're like, I'm just gonna go with it and let it be.
I was pretty comfortable with the go with it and let it be, but I've noticed, trying to say this in a very politic way, like even a lot of folks who seem to like it review-wise, who are perhaps maybe cis and straight, like do just read them both as trans men in today's terms. And I've done a couple of interviews where I've had to gently be like, well, that's not really what the text says. And like, how do I reframe this perception? One of them would be if we used contemporary language, but the other one isn't. Like Leslie would, I think, if we had to do the contemporary maneuver, the historians are cringing a little bit, probably be like on that end of the spectrum that's more he, him, dyke. Like that would be, I think, the contemporary Leslie identity, which does not prevent him from having sex with a gay trans man. It works out for them. They have to work through those things. And that shows kind of how the labels don't always hold. Like I think labels as convenient descriptors can be useful, but no more than that. And I think that's the intra-community stuff, right? Like when I'm not concerned with explaining it to like the beloved straight reviewer who maybe doesn't quite get it but loves it. They're here for it. I want to support that. And be like, okay, but they have a conversation in the book where Leslie is just like, hey, this is what I am. Are you this? And Stevie's like, I don't know, man. I don't know about that. So, you know, working through that, I thought it was very clear. And now as you see your text through someone else's eyes, a very different audience, it's interesting to compare who sees what. And I think I had a little of that with Summer Sons too, for like people who have had the experience of being really attracted to men who are maybe straight, and it wasn't awesome, like to do that, immediately recognizing in the text, oh yeah, this boy's like looking at a lot of thighs and collarbones. Like he doesn't know what he's doing, but the text knows. Versus like people who maybe didn't have that experience, even other queer people, would hit the middle and be like, oh shit, that boy's gay. Like, and it was interesting to compare who at what moment was like, I see what's happening here. Yeah. And it's a similar one here. I enjoy that though. This is a positive. I feel like if you want to expand to some of your older work too.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I think also you play with some of the identity spaces that way, particularly with bisexuality, I think, and the ways it can appear very differently for different people. Yeah. So you want to chime in?
You know, it is something. The thing about it is, I think up until this point, I've rarely used the term bisexuality in my work, which I realize I'm really trying to kind of work through, because I think that is some of that kind of internalized homophobia, internalized biphobia, that I never just would say the word. And I'm trying to figure out ways to work it in now without it just being like, oh, there she goes, has to work in that word. But, you know, I did a bisexuality and horror panel at StokerCon last year. And like I got together this group of bisexual writers, because we had talked about it on social media. And so I asked them, I'm like, do you use the word bisexuality in your work? And I think everyone on the panel was like, no, I've never used the term. And so that's something that I'm trying to work in there, even though all my characters are clearly coded as being, not all my characters, but many of my characters. I have many, like, you know, main characters in my work that are coded as being bisexual, but trying to really make sure, like, moving forward, that that's more overt. Yeah. I really finally came out specifically because I was writing so many queer characters. Like I had tried to come out when I was younger. It went very, very badly. And being bisexual is a strange kind of liminal identity anyways, because it's like, my husband is sitting here. Like, you know, we look like a straight couple. We'll never be a straight couple because I'm not straight. But, you know, you can have that appearance, and it's that you're not less queer for having an opposite gendered partner, but you can hide much easier. And I was kind of hiding even from myself until like I really started writing. I got back into writing fiction, and all my characters kept being queer. And I was like, oh, you know, the first time I'm like, oh, that's weird. Like, look at that. Wonder why that happened. And then it happened again. I'm like, wow, that's really strange. And then after a while, and I'll probably turn bright red talking about this to this day. Yeah. You know, because it was like, and then finally I was like, oh, this probably goes back to that time I told people that I was not straight. At the time I just said gay, because everybody in the 90s really hated bisexuals. Like, it was this weird thing that like even queer people were like, oh, bisexuals. That stigma has really gone away for the most part in the queer community. I rarely come across that now, but like in the 90s it felt like that was the thing. Like straight people hated bisexuals and queer people like hated bisexuals. So it was like, you know, I didn't even want to use that word. So I'm like, I think maybe I'm gay. But then I was like, that doesn't make sense, because I'm definitely attracted to like some dude. So I'm like, I had no idea what was happening. I'm like, oh, maybe I'm just, you know. And then the sad thing is, then it's like, oh, you're just confused. And it's like, I wasn't confused. I knew what was happening, but there was just no outlet or resources for it. But it really did happen through my writing that eventually I'm like, I have so many queer characters, and this probably is related to that thing I haven't wanted to deal with for all these years. So that was, and then even with writing Velkwood, this book. So I was still not out at the time, even though I think everybody had pretty much guessed it because so many of my characters were queer, and it was like, and I wear Doc Martens. That's like always the joke that if you're a bisexual girl, you wear Doc Martens, not to be the stereotype.
Signaling is real.
Signaling is real. And so, yeah. And so like I started writing this book because I was past my deadline, and I'm like, okay, I need to get this book done. A bunch of things had happened in my personal life, and I start writing this book, and I'm like a third of the way through, and I've got to write to the deadline, and I'm like, oh no, this book is dealing with my sexuality. I'm like, this is not what I was trying to write. And then I had to finish it because I was on deadline. And at that point, I'm like, this is like the queerest book I've ever written. Even though I had queer characters, my last book, Reluctant Immortals, had a queer relationship between, it was a retelling of Dracula and Jane Eyre, and it queered the relationship between Bertha and Jane. And so they had fallen in love, and that really made Edward Rochester very angry because he was not very nice. But, with this book in particular, I'm like, okay, like I really need to start talking about this publicly, because my fear was like on Twitter, I was still on Twitter at the time. Sometimes there were people who were like, you're not allowed to write queer characters unless you're queer. And I don't agree with that to begin with. I think that's a really unpleasant thing, especially because there are a lot of people who can't be publicly out. And so my thought was, I had gone through so much trauma over so many years that the fear I had of like, what if somebody like says to me, you're not queer, you're not allowed to write this. I'm like, I'm not sure how I'll handle that, like emotionally after what I've gone through. So I'm like, it was finally a point that I'm like, I have to just come out. And so I was like, I think what I did, I know what I did. Like, I'm like, I just think, this thing that I did, and it was no big deal. And I didn't plan it for like 2 months ahead of time, but I like did my makeup in like a bi flag on like Twitter. And I'm like, oh, happy Pride Day. It was like the first day of Pride. I'm like, happy Pride, I forget what I did. I actually do forget that part, but it was something like, bisexual pride, yay, and like acted like it was like no big deal, and then like quickly logged out and like left the house because I didn't want to be anywhere near social media. Like, I'm like, okay, like that's done now. But so it's like, that was a long answer to that. But there is a lot of bisexuality in my work, even before I was like willing to be like, I am bisexual. Which still freaks me out sometimes when I say it in public, because for so long I'm like, you can't talk about that. Like bad things will happen to you if you talk about that, or you're not allowed to be that. Because that was a thing for a long time. I'm like, oh, I can't be that. Like we're talking about identity, and it's like, we know our identity. Nobody else gets to tell you what your identity is, but so much of the world will tell you what your identity is. And I struggled with that for a very long time of like, who am I and how do I get to define who that person is?
Yeah. I think so much too, culturally speaking, getting my doctorate in gender studies.
I love it.
Is that so we frame this often as like an individual identity box, and it's very systemic. Like a lot of these ways of experiencing power and privilege and harm and like the material ways your body moves through the world, like are not really about you, the individual. They're about the system that is around you and pressuring you in all these ways.
Yes.
And like, if we don't talk about that, it makes it all seem like it's just your responsibility to do the label right. Yeah. And particularly if you're a public figure, it can be very different. I think there's ways in which people feel very entitled to public figures in a specific way. That's like, hey, maybe we should learn to read all the signaling, or accept that like maybe someone wants to keep something for themselves. Yeah. And like we have a long history as queer people of being able to signal to each other without needing to tell the straights what we're doing. Yeah. And I think that's important for your survival space sometimes. Yes. Is someone like a different experience that I think they weave together is that I was like never capable of passing for straight or really cis, even before people knew what that was. And so I didn't have the choice in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of people do experience that. And it's something I think you see particularly a lot of queer men who are effeminate in their presentation in some way from childhood. Be like, well, I didn't get to choose the closet. Yeah. Like that's a different experience. And a lot of people don't survive it. Yeah. And that's such a thing that those can hold hands though. I think they're part of the same system. They are. That like keeps you from talking about it by sort of denigrating your ability to do so.
Yes.
Like, you're illegitimate in some way, so you don't talk about it, so no one sees that.
Yeah.
And if someone can see it because you can't do that, then we'll try to destroy it in a different way.
Yeah.
And it's all the same systemic pressures.
It is.
On that, I think.
It is. And there can almost be a divide and conquer even within the queer community of like, oh, well, this is a more legitimate trauma than this. And the system is the trauma. And it's like, you know, it all is bad. It's all bad. And it's all part of that kind of same thing that is trying to tell us who we are and how we're allowed to present ourselves or not allowed, and how much that's just bad for everyone. It's so bad for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the like over policing that happens in that way as like a defensive response is not good for other queer people.
Yeah.
Generally, especially some of that like intensity of the insistence, right, on labeling yourself in a particular way.
Yeah.
It's like I rotate through a regular cast of labels depending on who I'm talking to.
Yeah.
Because some of these are for family only. Because I don't want a straight person to call me certain words that among other gay men I might call myself. Like, you don't want that. So I don't want to open that door.
Yeah.
But also, like, if you're trans, as I am, even the idea of like being gay directly, behaviorally, I'm bisexual. Broadly speaking, I've had those experiences. And I think calling back to the 90s of it all, like Pat Califia's old essay that I just reread recently, that is called, the title is something to the effect of gay men and lesbians doing it together. And it is before they transitioned. So at this point, they were like a leather dyke presentationally and had written an essay about how they had started having sex with gay men. Like, they were like, we're both still gay, but we're doing something here that's really interesting and liberating and very cool. And they did later transition. So some of these things also make sense in hindsight in a different way. But I still think that essay was really pointing to something about community space when we're not being as defensive against each other.
Yes.
It's like, actually, like maybe all of us have a little of this interesting way of moving around attraction to masculinity specifically, maybe like attraction to femininity. What does it mean to be a trans man who's effeminate? Like all of these things. And I was thinking about it. You're talking about the ways that bisexuality is treated now. Zachary Zane just had a book, Boy Slut, come out where he's talking a lot about his bisexuality and the way bi men are still loathed, like broadly speaking.
Yeah. I think it's gotten better than since the 90s, but you're right. Yeah, bi men are still. Yeah, they were. But you're right. Yeah, for bisexual women, I think that it's better. We can still be kind of treated almost in this kind of very highly sexualized way.
You can be re-co-opted by the patriarchal narrative against your will.
Exactly.
Like that is,
you are right. That absolutely is
that's
something.
the goal.
And one of the things was, even when I was putting together the bisexuality and horror panel, I think we only had one, male author on it because a lot of bi men aren't out. And that was something I even like went to some other bi friends and other queer friends. I'm like, do you know of any bi men that I could invite? And everybody's like, I know of some people that have told me privately, but they're not publicly out. And so we, and that was really sad to me. So you're absolutely right. And thank you for bringing up that point, because there is still that stigma. I think it is less than, like you said, from the hellscape of the 90s, but it's still a problem. And it's it is again with these labels of like, you have to behave in a certain way, or somehow you're a traitor, or you're not queer enough, or you're too queer, or whatever. And it is very strange. It's a very strange way of looking
it's messy. And I think we just have to live in the mess.
I think so.
I think these characters a lot are doing in all of these texts.
I think so.
I throw in a Summer Sons on that, the writing your own trauma kind of thing, where people sure will ask you about those things. You're like, it's about the character, but also I know it's not.
Yeah, I know, right? Right.
And answering that's very awkward.
It is. It is like, right. Like talking about the Haunting of Velkwood, I'm always like, okay, how far do I want to go with this? And sometimes it's like, okay, I'll stop here. And other times, like, I'm just going to like trauma dump on everybody because you asked a question. I didn't offer it. But
I think the characters, seeing how people responded to labeling characters in the text who did not give one, because like culturally speaking, the space they're in, some of them wouldn't, and they don't care in a different way. Like our protagonist, Andrew, God bless, like he'll get there. It's going to be a bit before he's got a word that he likes in any way, shape, or form. But you also have Riley, who's very queer and out and trans and knows it and is bisexual and doesn't mind talking about it. And I think people really struggled with wanting to label Andrew also that way. And like, he's not there yet. Like he needs to define that space in a way. And I think leaving that room for characters can help audience also, particularly younger readers who are maybe still working through that themselves, to not feel that level of intense pressure. Like, it's okay. You can be in your 30s and be figuring it out. People get divorced in their 40s and transition, like, and realize, oh man, okay, happened a lot in the pandemic. And I want to leave that door open a lot in my work for people to like redefine, figure it back out. That's the Zachary Zane book. Again, if you are, into bisexuality studies and male bisexuality, it's like, how do we talk about the fact that for some people, it really is horribly a phase that they experience as a teenager. They're like, I thought I was straight, maybe I'm bi. And then, they figure out that they're not, but their best friend might be like, no, I am bi though. And they're like, fascinatingly, I don't think I am actually, now that I've had a minute. Yeah. And how do we make room for that without pressuring people?
Exactly, because I think that is something that, some people, their bisexuality is that transition phase, and that doesn't make their experience any less than, or mine as someone who is absolutely bisexual. And you're right, because it is, I think we get so stuck on those labels, and then it's like, oh, well, you need to hurry up and decide, but there's no rush. Like, I remember one of the things that helped me the most was, my graduate degrees in psychology, but when I was an undergrad, I was introduced to the term sexual fluidity. And I was like, that was like a revelation when I was like 19 or 20, because like I came from a small town and I had no idea that this was something that, could be malleable. I was like, you were either this or that, and that's it. And there's nothing else. And to realize that, people can shift over the course of their lifetime was like, and it honestly makes sense, because we shift in a lot of ways, right? We change as people. And the idea that it's like, oh, you need to figure this out by the time you're 10 or 12 or 14 or 18 or whatever. And then you're done. You don't get to find out anything more about yourself. And I do think when I think about this a lot, about one of the reasons why I think there is such a backlash right now against the queer community is because the queer community is so much more out there and public. And now people are really starting to get freaked out. These people are like, I'm straight and that's all that I could possibly be. And now it's like, oh, well, what if that isn't? What if there's a lot of other possibilities and a lot of permutations? And it's like, I think it's very scary to a lot of people, because they want to believe in these absolutes, and they want to believe that, oh, all queer people are just aberrations, and this is just this weird thing that happens. And the idea that, like, what is it, 1 in 5 of Gen Z is queer, and it's like that. It's like, oh, there's so much queer. It's like, no, this is how queer everybody's been. They just didn't have the freedom to be able to talk about it. And having people realize, like, oh, this might actually be very normal. It's not monstrous at all. It's very, very normal. And then realizing maybe some people are like, oh, I always think if you're really obsessing that much about queer people and you're not queer, like, maybe you are queer. Like, it's always that thing that a lot of times people who are very homophobic, there might be something going on there. And there's so much internalized homophobia, which is very sad, but also extremely dangerous. And it's a very weird line to realize that in some of those cases that might be some of where it's coming from. Now, obviously religion, obviously politics, there's obviously a lot of other reasons, but I do sometimes think that internalized homophobia of like, I don't want to face this, so you're not allowed to be this either. Yeah.
Something that I think about that, like a couple back there, that I think the language element in The Woods All Black that I was having fun with is that our words change so quickly sometimes. Like, non-binary occurred in my adult lifetime. Like, it was genderqueer was the big one when I was like playing with that language. And I think when I was like 14, I found an old journal. It was like, I am just a gay boy, but I got born this way. How do we do that? And then I buried that for a while because we didn't have the words that I could access for what that was at that time. Yeah. And then we came back and figured it out. But I think it's interesting to see how the words and the language change so quickly sometimes, because from 29 to 24, like, we've had complete shifts in our ways of understanding these things. And that's just an Anglophone Western culture. Also, so if you do any studies anywhere else, you get to be like, oh, this is not actually the only way of thinking of these things. Like, there are other ways of conceiving gender outside of particularly a Christian patriarchal system that just have existed. There's other ways of doing things. And I think that can open people up too, is seeing there's a whole world of proliferating possibilities and words and ways of being that might change for you. Yeah. And that's okay. Yeah. Sometimes you might find a new one. Like, I think that works. Yeah. And some people don't. And that's cool. There are
Mhm.
definitely folks who know from day one, they've got it.
Yeah.
And I like having kind of both of those types of characters to
Yes.
explore in queer stories,
Mhm.
because I think we don't get as much of that in sometimes mainstream, like queer texts that are designed to be read kind of quote by everyone rather, which we need those too, not denigrating them in any way.
Yes.
But you don't get as
Mhm.
much room to explore
Mhm.
because there's certain ways of being and presenting that are
Mhm.
like maybe the 701 level, we'll say, like if it's a course in university.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's fun to have texts that cover all of those spaces and can be in conversation with each other.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that. And about the evolution of words, I love using the word queer. I think because it's been reclaimed and because it was such a negative word when I was growing up. But like I'll talk to people who are like, wait, that's an okay word to use. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, some people still don't like it. And that's interesting. You use the word dyke. I hate that word because I was called that as a child. So that has a very bad connotation. But I understand for me, but I understand for a lot of people, it's fine. But even saying it just now, I'm like, I can't say that word. It's terrible. But I'm like, it's not terrible to everyone. Just like queer is still a word for a lot of people. It's like, I don't like that word. I was called that, But for me, I felt like I could reclaim that one. Dyke is still one that I'm like, I'm still coming around to. Your dedication, I think, is it includes that word.
Fags, dykes, and gender outlaws.
Yeah.
Because there's a politics to that,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Like, and I think
Mhm.
that's something that is very important about the word queer that I think I care about a lot as an academic, to put my nerd hat on in that way, that it is a political word above all else. And so is reclaiming other words like that. It's not merely comfort in that way. It is aggressive. Like it's very intentionally aggressive, particularly to people who will call you that in a negative way.
Yes.
But just some of that reclaiming your monstrousness, etc.
Yeah.
And particularly there's a podcast, Food for Thought. I don't know if anyone else listens to it. They did a really good episode on the differences they feel speaking in community between the word gay, queer, and fag, and the ways that those really occupy different identity spaces. And all of them at that point were like, it's important to me to signal in a political, like gay way that I am effeminate. Like I'm all of these things that gay men are not supposed to be culturally, that are denigrated. And I really value that. And it's a way of signaling my politics, like particularly to maybe the Pete Buttigieg's of the world, like that this is the kind that I am.
Yeah.
And that's an aggressive maneuver on purpose. So it makes people uncomfortable. I don't like go on a radio podcast and say it still. But if I'm in a like room of other like leather guys or in a gay space, that's pretty common, like to use to really signal those ways. And I think particularly about queer as a solidarity politics also, like to our old Kathy Cohen in 1997, where she's writing about the ways that like even maybe poor straight Black women can be included in this space of queer, because we're talking about the systemic power that is against people. So you can also share that space with other queer people who are outside of the norms of sexuality and reproduction and systemic power, that's a place we can held hands, we can form solidarity.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really cool about it.
Yeah.
Is it's not only reclaiming the bad word, it is being like, no, this is a politics.
Yeah.
And I'm committed to a politics with it, of other people coming into it with me. And it matters to challenge that systemic power together, even though our experiences might be really different.
Yeah.
Language.
I love it.
Did we get to question time?
I think so.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful place to kind of pause and invite other folks into the conversation with us.
Absolutely.
So do we have folks who are here in the room with us who want to raise their hand and ask a question?
Be brave.
Yeah.
I'll start us out just while folks are thinking of their question. One of the things I was thinking about is how you represent politics in historical fiction. So the evolution, obviously it's more noticeable.
Sorry about that.
It's more noticeable in your book, Lee, because it's older, the time period is older, but like, how do you take your main characters, relative, like, they're an outsider going into a community that is less politically evolved. And so that's an opportunity for you to interject some, narrative wisdom. But how do you take 2024 politics, in particular like queer analysis, anti-racist politics, things like that, anti-capitalist politics even, and then make sure that it still feels authentic within the text?
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, I think it might be the academic work, because I think people tend to treat those as really separate writing projects, but it's very
Yeah.
cyclical for
Yeah.
me, where it's like,
Yeah.
I'll be doing this research that will feed into an interest that I need to work through in art. Then
Yeah.
we go back to the research. And I
Mhm.
think that I also was very interested seeing, God, interested's a dark word for this. Like, we are back in a very intense right-wing moment globally, and it is
Mhm.
largely organized around gender in a lot of ways, and
Yeah.
around queer as this object. And any kind of justice movement, depending on the nations in question. I know Judith Butler's book just came out also yesterday, the new one, Who's Afraid of Gender, that is very much looking at how the right wing, not just in the US, not just in
No.
Europe, but also
No.
India, also other places currently, Hungary, are really using the idea of gender ideology and the existence of queer people at all as a wedge issue in ways that are
Yes.
very localized to their own politics.
Mhm.
And that was also the case if we go back. And I think looking at historical time, 100 years, like, kind of ain't shit. Like, that's basically yesterday in
Yeah.
terms of historical development.
Mhm.
We're still having the same problems in a lot
Yeah.
of ways.
Yeah.
We've moved a little, but how much really? We're still living in the timeline that World War I created and the colonial projects that arose out of that and around that time.
Mhm.
So I think a lot about that in the work is that how do I do that research and also read a lot of contemporary political theorists and think about how those are interrelated. And then you have to filter it down like 3 more levels into making the art about it.
Mhm.
And I think the editing process for this one involved a lot more like very careful detail work with my editor between, okay, you stated this so directly that it feels like I'm reading your dissertation. And like, you stated this so obliquely that I think you know what you meant, but I don't actually think people who aren't familiar with this are going to get what you're doing here. And recalibrating with another set of eyes, I think, is really important in that way, or a few more sets of eyes. Be like, what did you get out of it? Did you get the thing that I wanted you to get? Maybe not. Maybe we have to do it again. And I do think that's part of the like art and politics in art in politics, like cycle.
Yeah. You know, with Velkwood, because it's not, you know, I feel like with that one, for me, it was much more like politics are all personal. Everything is, you know, personal is political, and kind of thinking about that. And again, you know, my research wasn't necessarily a steep level because yours is longer ago, but thinking about what the 90s meant and the 2000s meant and how we've changed and how we've stayed the same or how we could go back, and trying to kind of filter all of that in through the characters' experiences was definitely, you know, kind of what I was thinking about when I was writing this book. Yeah.
Anybody have a question?
Hi. My name is Sean. It's nice to meet you guys. It's been great hearing you guys' takes on each other's works. And the question that I had was, like, do you guys think about how to drive people who read your works from the stories into like political action? Or worded a different way, like, have you thought about how to get people from these books and the stories they tell into communal spaces?
Ooh, I like that. I like that. To me, you know, one of the things, a lot of my characters are kind of working through their identity. And so to me, once you've worked through that identity, I think a lot of times you naturally seek community. And so that's one of the things for me is trying to find those ways to kind of maybe start conversations or allow people to feel more comfortable as hopefully, you know, seeing themselves in the work. And maybe from there, that would kind of be more of a natural extension of like, okay, I feel more comfortable. Maybe I could go, you know, talk to other people about this book, or, you know, talk to people about queer literature in general, or just be able to kind of feel more comfortable seeking out spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is where a lot of writers, myself included, kind of hate to think of ourselves as public figures in a different way than like an actor, right? Or a musician even, but we are. And I think that's a lot of what I think about with the art that I do is what else am I doing around it? Like, what resources am I sharing? And I think I probably a lot more about that being that I'm finishing a PhD in teaching in gender studies. So some of my day job life, right, is how do I, especially with younger students, 18 or 19, who have maybe never been talked to about how justice movements intersect, like how their queerness could carry them into caring about other political projects that are connected in the same system.
Yeah.
So I think a lot about my public profile, like even your social media, as like a way to share resources and try to direct people in that way to politics that matter to them, especially locally. Even when it comes to like go vote in your local elections, like care about your school board, even from small things. And I think that that does have some kind of effect. And I get a lot of interesting fan mail, particularly from like young gay and or trans folks. They're like, oh, I didn't know about XYZ and I saw this book on your Instagram and read it. And that feels like a nice thing. It's very small, I think, in the grand scheme of things. But also it's one person at a time who might then go to another person in their community. And I do try to emphasize, as much as I am too online, aren't we all a little bit, to get like off your computer and go to your local community and see what people there need. Like instead of posting, perhaps see if there's a queer organization in your neighborhood that is doing outreach to houseless folks or elders in your community. And I think then I'm ironically posting about that. So I know. But yeah, I do think the art can get people into it a little and get them activated. And then what kind of public profile you have can shape that more. And I do think it's a commitment that I feel I should have. And also very much to boost the work of other like scholar activists who are really, really doing the work actively in a way that I cannot claim to be in the same way, like to boost those voices over my own, particularly on topics that are not my direct lived experience, but that I care about, etc. If that's a solid answer.
That was great from both of you. Thank you. And can I ask another one? To kind of launch off of that question from before, have you guys thought about expanding your the medium that you're in right now into other mediums? Shameless plug, I'm an animator. And I've been wanting to gear my skills towards these spaces because these spaces are interesting. So there you go. So yeah, I was wondering, like, have you guys thought about that, like getting it into TV shows, getting it into film, or just keeping where it's at, which admittedly this is like this intimate space with this group of people. This is great.
I love film.
Yes, so do I.
I feel like a lot of horror and gothic writers are immediate like, I too love the movies.
Yes, right? I think that's so true.
Yeah. I think I'm allowed to say we have an option on Summer Suns, but that's as far as it's gotten, and that might never go anywhere because we all know how that industry works. But I've got my fingers crossed because I do think visual media do things that text don't for different audiences in very interesting ways. Like I wouldn't be the writer that I am without all the filmic and visual art, also text that made me who I am, that I'm interpreting those things in a like linguistic way. So I think, yes, I like those things. And also podcasts, frankly. We're in like still the era a little bit. I learn a lot from particularly like activist podcasts and even just poets. Poets have the best podcasts. Vibe Check is one of my favorites, like Saeed Jones and Sam Sanders and Zach Stafford do. And it's pop culture, but also politics. And it's all a queer lens in that way. So yeah, I like a podcast.
Yeah, I like that podcast. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love film. There's a couple of my things, again, been optioned. Like, I'm not even going to say which ones. We're not even at that stage. I'm not even saying it. I don't want to spoil it. But yeah, so exactly. For both of us. So hopefully, right? Yeah, but those are great. Yeah.
Different audiences, I think, is the coolest part of that, being able to work in a different medium, because there's people who are very good at it who I deeply respect. And I'm like, how do you do that? How are you that good at multiple things?
Well, we would be psyched for some visual interpretations of your work. We got a couple online questions. So as horror writers, have you ever experienced writer's block, similar to how horror movies stop being scary once you see a monster? After going through so many drafts, do you ever struggle to keep the intensity in your writing when you know what happens next?
Ooh, I like that. So much of the horror in my work is other people. I feel like those are the scariest things. Like there might, it's only like the ghosts are only scary because they were originally people, or the monsters I might like more, but it's the people who don't like the monsters. So probably to a certain extent. I feel like writer's block, everybody gets to that point at some time. But I think, I always go back to what scares me, and it's always other people. It's always the harm that other people can do. So when I go back to that, I'm like, nope, still scared of that. Be scared of that forever.
Yeah. I think I'm one of those folks who has a really intense revision and rewriting process, which I feel like is common among like other, particularly like poet friends and people who do a lot of lit work, where they're so invested in the line, maybe even more so than I am. But I tend to rewrite a lot from the rough, like zero draft, because that's just sort of spilling it all out. Like there's a structure now, like there's bones, but there's no flesh on them.
Oh, I love
and
that.
so a lot of the work that I really enjoyed the most is actually putting the meat on the bones, stitching it together for our Frankenstein's monster, to come back to that
for
again.
your Frankenstein's monster story.
Yeah, but I think that's not where I get stuck, broadly speaking. Usually that's the fun part in a weird way. I say fun now that I'm done with it. Anyone who's experienced me doing it is like, no, you hate that. You complain. You're so mad the whole time. But afterwards, I forget that I felt that way. I think for me, the closest thing to writer's block actually tends to be the trough between projects, which I think is actually super normal and natural. And this is, again, like a creative writing teacher moment, I guess, for workshopping. It's okay to not be able to work for a little bit, especially if you've just written a book.
Yeah.
It's actually fine to not be able to work for a little while, which I think the industry largely discourages.
Yes.
And if you have to pay a mortgage and have health insurance in this country, that largely discourages.
Yeah.
But I want to always be like, no, it's okay. You don't have to write every day forever until you die. Like you're allowed to take time off to read more books and just live in it.
And that was something like I always think of, like the Beatles went off. Joni Mitchell would always go. I always think of like these singer-songwriters, like they would just disappear for a while. Like they would just be like, I'm going on the road. I'm going like, to another country. Like I'm just going to go and explore and figure myself out. And I'm like, we need to like give people the space to do that, because like you said, it's normal to have downtime. Like creativity is it's not assembly line. And yet we're all expected like at least one book a year. And I'm like, I can't do that. Like, and there's I know some people do 2 or 3 books a year. And I'm like, that I know, right? That's how I'm like, that's fine. If that's what makes someone happy, I'm not against a person doing that. I don't like the mindset that we all have to do it, because that's a lot. And
I'm incapable of that.
Exactly. And I certainly can't do it and be happy, know? And so it's like, I like the idea of allowing that space and just taking time to figure out creatively what you want to do next. Yeah.
We have one more online, and then I think we can transition to the book signing so everybody has a chance to get the book
Actually,
signed.
I think, do we have a question over
we got
here
one.
too? I think.
All right.
Yeah.
Great. Sorry. Thank you.
Hayden.
Let's get you first.
Hi. So there's a lot of like, maybe it's like a history flattening thing, but there's like cultural moments and like a kind of horror that blooms from it, like birth control and like demon babies, or like AIDS and vampires.
Oh yeah.
And like both of your books are very similar and of a moment. Like, do you think those movements are like organic, or are you inspired by other books that are coming out? Like, oh, that's interesting. Like, where does that, do you think that still happens organically or not?
I think it does, because, like I think we're both talking about this kind of rise of the right wing and the backlash. So I think, we're all living in the same environment. So I think it just starts inspiring certain things, and there's a kind of natural movement towards the direction that it goes, I would say. Yeah.
And I think a lot of inspiration is definitely super normal. I think that that's really a fun project for text, is to be like, what do I think went into this?
Yeah.
Particularly after I'm done.
Yeah.
Sometimes going back and reading it after the high of creation, whatever, has passed, being like, oh, I think this is thanks to this person's book that I read, that pinged something for me.
Yeah.
And I also think more broadly than those individual ones, you can kind of sense the currents, right?
Yes.
Going and thinking about the 90s specifically, like 90s queer horror was really important to me. And now as an adult, with the context of like, yes, the tail end, like the very brutal last 7 years or so till the drug cocktail is available of the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Yes.
It makes sense that there is so much queer horror that was really lightning rod intense at that point, that I was reading and experiencing as a kid, like a teen, even going back to it, and didn't really grasp what went into it.
Yeah.
But now I do. And as an artist, I kind of also feel like I reflect back on some of the older stuff that like you didn't know you were intaking what you were intaking, but now it's become really important to your like makeup. And I'm specifically thinking about this because I just finished reading the forthcoming Gretchen Felker-Martin's new book, Cuckoo, which was phenomenal, FYI. No one's probably surprised. But it very much, I had to email her and be like, was this about Stephen King's It? Like, at least partially? Was that in the DNA of this book? And she's like, yes, absolutely. And it's like, hell yeah. Because you read it too young in the 90s. You read it and had a lot of feelings about it in a lot of ways. And now we're the artists who are like, people in your late 30s going into your 40s had all these similar moments, or mid 30s in my case. Like, that range of texts are coming back in our work also. So the contemporary stuff, like the books I read that came out 6 months ago, and the stuff that is like the base layer of the X-Files or Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
Like, I just finished watching a show. It was like a Thai slasher horror show that was phenomenal, Dead Friend Forever. And you can really tell that they were thinking about Laura Palmer and how the show is constructed. You're like, I see you. I see you. I see what this is. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that stuff.
Yeah.
Like, we all make each other's work.
We do.
Do you have, if you could just shout out one, I know you just shouted out Cuckoo, but if you could each just shout out one horror or horror adjacent book that you want folks to know about.
I keep going with this one. It's not a queer horror book, but Krista Carmen's The Daughters of Block Island. It's on the Bram Stoker ballot for first novel, and I love it. I blurbed it. It's a great one. It's gothic, but it's kind of like meta gothic, sort of deconstructing the gothic. It's a great one.
Say it one more time. The Daughters of Block Island.
Block.
All right.
Island. Yep.
Cool.
Since I did a horror one, I'm going to cheat and do just like the best queer fiction book I've read this year. Unsurprisingly, Justin Torres' Blackouts that won the National Book Award. So I'm not a unique person contributing to this. But what I think doesn't get talked about as much that really lit me on fire as a reader is it's an art object as a book. Like, if there are copies here, look at it. It's printed in brown ink. Because a lot of what he's working with in the text is actual old historical photos of queer people through time. And one of the first texts of sexological research that was published, like in the US, where some shitty straight doctors stole a lesbian woman's ethnographic interviews and rewrote them basically to be really negative about queer people. And he's taken the pages of this text and blacked out all of the things that the doctors had said to leave the people's words. And those are intercut through a story of a younger queer man waiting at the bedside of an older man that he was once institutionalized with as he dies, and talking about history and having these conversations about film back and forth. That's also referencing like Manuel Puig's Kiss of the Spider Woman. It's phenomenal. I read it and was like, books can do this. I don't know how he did this. I have no idea how you do this, but I loved it. It took him like 15 years to that point.
That's how you do it. You take 15 years.
Yeah. So yes, that's my cheat.
Moral of the story, take the time that the story needs. Well, this was phenomenal. Our folks who are watching virtually say thank you so much. Thanks for streaming. Thank you, everybody, for being physically with us tonight. I want to let our folks who are watching online that they can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy both of these books. You can also buy the backlist. There's lots of great stuff to dig into. Also, I dropped the link for Bury Your Gaze and Boy Slut in the chat, so you can buy those books. For folks who are here, we have those books in the store if you want to buy them here. It's always great to buy, and I think we have Blackout in stock, hopefully. Certainly a book we love and carry. So buy books.